2020 budget is now law, in record time at that, as President Buhari appends his signature to the financial document on his birthday. The long journey to implementation now begins, and that's our major story tonight. And a bill proposing a single 6-year tenure for presidents and governors in the country is shot down by lawmakers in the House of Representatives. Well, it's been trailed by a lot of criticism, and we get the man behind it to respond to some of them tonight. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the program. This is Politics Today, live on Channels Television. I am Kayode Okikulu. Well, the year 2019 is winding down quite all right, but the various arms of government are still making major moves, especially at the executive and legislature. That's the National Assembly. Now, one of the biggest stories coming out of the nation's capital today is, of course, the signing of the 2020 budget by President Muhammadu Buhari exactly 70 days after he presented the proposal to the National Assembly. Well, it's a record-breaking budget on different counts. The 10.594 trillion naira budget is one of the highest in Nigeria's history. It's also one of the earliest coming into law before the end of the year. And this means Nigeria has returned to the January-December budget cycle. But there's one more thing. Birthdays are usually marked with the customary cutting of the cake, but the president took it a step further today, which happens to be his birthday, by also signing the 2020 budget. So you can call it the national cake. I'm just saying. Well, what a way to celebrate his 77th. But let's listen to the president.
This patriotic zeal adopted by the National Assembly has restored our budget cycle to a predictable January to December fiscal year. I have directed that efforts be made to ensure the presentation of the 2021 appropriation bill to the National Assembly in September 2020.
Now that the first major hurdle has been crossed, the government is now faced with the critical task of making that document a reality. For the Nigerian people, it's a huge one, especially when you look at previous budget performances, and that will form a major part of our discussion tonight. But first, let's bring you some other stories we are tracking for you on our political roundup.
Earlier in the day, the president offered Nigerians the assurance that he will superintend over a free, fair and credible elections in 2023. The president made this promise at the occasion of his 77th birthday, marked at the presidential villa. He says whoever wants to contest must work hard, as he would not condone anyone using his name or office to canvass for support.
Elections are free and fair. Nobody uses his office or his resources to force himself on his constituencies.
The Enugu State Governor Ifeanyi Ugwuanyi has presented the 2020 appropriation bill of 169.557 billion naira to the State House of Assembly, tagged Budget of Responsive and Accountable Governance, with 55.27% higher than that of 2019 budget. According to the governor, capital project is 100.77 billion naira, representing 59.43% of total budget, while 68.79 billion naira, representing 40.57% of total budget, is for recurrent expenditure. As the House promises to pass the budget before the year runs out, the governor believes the 2020 budget will consolidate and expand the existing milestone of government on the development of human and capital resources, and as well aid the delivery of basic services in the state. The mood at the Oyo State Secretariat is a joyous one, as workers received their December salary on the 16th for the first time in history of civil service in the state. In the same vein, the government is finalizing arrangement to ensure payment of 13-month salary immediately after Christmas celebrations to help workers for the New Year celebrations. The secretary to the state government says the move was aimed at alleviating the suffering of the workforce who had in the past waited with bated breath to get their salaries and allowances.
So the 2020 budget and the road to implementation is our focus tonight. What is different with this budget? What are some of the potholes to watch out for? And what happens to the 2019 budget? And more questions. To shed more light on them, we're being joined by Mr. Oyalowo, a political economist. He joins us from our Abuja studio. And joining us via Skype is Mr. Taiwo Oyedele, is a fiscal policy and partner, West Africa tax leader at the PwC. Thank you so much, gentlemen, for joining us tonight on the program. So I'd like to begin with you, Mr. Oyalowo. Now, amidst the pomp and excitement is the work ahead of us, which I believe you appreciate, the work of implementing this budget. But then there are also concerns that there might be vague, fraudulent and self-enrichment projects in the budget. In fact, an editorial on one of Nigeria's dailies was asking the president to beware of signing the budget. I want to believe you have seen this, and I'd like you to respond to them. Do you think Nigerians should be worried?
Well, we know that the finance bill accompanied the budget. So it is not just budget, there's a finance bill that will be signed in the next couple of days, like the president rightly said today. So yes, Nigeria should be watchful, not worried. Typically, you are going to have issues with some of the line items. That is no doubt, because there are still human beings there. What we need to watch and ask ourselves is, you see, some of these monies will never be released. That is the truth. Because some of the projects, like you rightly said, may not be beneficial project to Nigerians. So I believe that this president specifically will ensure that whatever monies are released are monies that can be accounted for. I believe that is the wisdom behind the finance bill. You know, before this budget was signed, there is also this something that accompanied the budget, the Deep Offshore and Inland Basin Production Sharing Contract Amendment Bill that was not signed in 2018 by the 8th Assembly, which has now been signed. So that is an advantage and a big plus for Nigeria. I believe that if now that we have returned to the proper budget cycle, we can now have effective monitoring, number one. Then number two, we can also clearly know what performance we can rate with our budget, because clearly we've been having budget that has been doing for, that we've been running for 6 months or thereabout, very unpredictable cycle, which is difficult for plannings and for those who monitor the planning. So for the first time, we're going to have a budget that will run the full cycle of 12 months, so we'll be able to see the accurate figures for implementation and performance. So for me, there is nothing to be worried about. There's just more to watch out for, so that we can, at the end of this coming year, fiscal year, we can say this is the actual performance of the budget, 60%, 50%, 100%, or whatever. But that will be good if we have this continuously. Then
Okay.
we can adequately monitor the performance, and we can rate the budget as either a performance budget that performed or a budget that failed.
Okay, so let's go to Mr. Oyedele, who joins us via Skype. Now, the 2019 budget was 9.12 trillion naira, and as at October, the Minister of Finance said we had achieved 58% performance. So, talking about the 2019 budget, a lot of people are wondering what happens to it now that the 2020 budget has come into law. What happens to the 2019 budget?
Yeah, I think the first thing is to commend the National Assembly and the President, the Executive, for making sure that we now have a budget before the end of December. So that in itself returns us to the fiscal year that starts in January and runs till December. Having said that, because really, it's only just symbolic. If you do it even in July and you keep doing it in July, you'll be fine. The problem we've had in the past is that we pass the budget and then it's another 16, 17 months before the next one. Now that we have done this and 2019 is still running its course, government has to make it a point of duty that from January 2020, we will continue to implement 2019 while we commence the implementation of 2020 budget. So it has to go hand in hand, particularly the capital expenditure component, because we tend to do very well with implementing recurrent expenditure. But the component of the budget that is really, really important in terms of development is to do with capital expenditure and human capital development. Those components of the budget for 2019 should continue to run until when it will be 12 months from when 2019 budget was enacted into an appropriation act. in parallel with 2020 that will commence in January 2020.
Now, gentlemen, I'd like us to shift our attention, from the national budget. I know it's a big deal, but let's now look at states because, we have the federal level and then there are states. And, we try to look around states that have budgets also. And these are some of the states that have, submitted their budget proposals to their state assembly. And let's try to show you some of the states. You see Akwa Ibom, Anambra State, Bauchi, so Benue State, Cross River, Ebonyi, Imo, you see from 597 billion to 197 billion. And there are other states like Kaduna, which has signed their budget into law. You have states like Katsina, Kogi, there you go, Lagos, 1.17 trillion naira, Osun, 119, Oyo, Enugu. And these are states that also have budgets. I know that we always talk about the national budget, but let me begin with Mr. Oyalowo. There's always attention on the national level, but then how do states' budget also key in, such that as much as we're paying attention, at the national level, we also look at the states and find a way to harmonize these budgets? Because if you look at the figures, cumulatively, the state's budget actually are more than the national budget. So how do we begin to harmonize this such that it works at the federal and at the state levels?
Thank you, Kayode. I'm glad you're asking this question. This has been some of the failure of the press, in my opinion. We put too much attention on Abuja and we forget that the state actually touch the lives of the people more. Apart from Kaduna State, since we started this current dispensation and under the current governor, there's been no state that has been able to pass their budget on time. Only Kaduna has been doing that consistently under Malam El-Rufai. At December, their budget is ready for January. And you can see how they have performed. Currently, they are the only state that have more of capital expenditure, about 70% capex to 30% recurrent. So clearly, the state have to complement because, for instance, I see people argue on how much we spend on education. And that is very, very funny because we miss the point. The point is the federal government only caters for tertiary education. The primary and the secondary education that actually touch our life more is in the hands of the state. So before you can look at the size of the budget, you have to include those of each state of the federation. Then you cannot say, this is the total budget of Nigeria. But we always fail to do this. So the states are the ones who must ensure they complement what the federal government is doing in terms of, one, education, in terms of health, in terms of environmental and sanitation. Those are very key areas that the state themselves must kick in and ensure that the right things are done so that whatever the federal government is doing, it will just be a complementary push. The federal government needs to basically work more on the policy areas, while the state should be more in terms of touching the lives of the people in terms of implementation.
Let's get Mr. Oyedele.
Focus attention, and that is the job of you journalists.
Right. Let's get Mr. Oyedele's perspective on this now, talking about the states. So when people place premium on budgets, how should it go, federal and states? Which one should we pay more attention to, or how do we go about this?
Yeah, I think we should pay equal attention to both the federal and the states. I think historically Nigerians pay a lot of attention to the federal, but not enough attention to the state. And my thinking is, from what I've seen from states across Nigeria, is they do not seem to even understand the budgeting process. So for 2019, the aggregate budget for all the states in Nigeria is about 9 trillion, whereas the revenue they made in 2018 was 1.1 trillion IGR and 2.5 trillion from FAC. So altogether, they made 3.6 trillion, but they are budgeting for 9 trillion in 2019. That same pattern has now continued for 2020. We have some states where they're budgeting over 1 trillion naira, even though their revenue has never been able to get up to 100 billion. So you then end up with states that promise a lot in capital expenditure and end up implementing almost zero. So we have to start paying attention to the state budget so that we can have the level of discipline and diligence that is required to ensure that not only are the budgets realistic, but they're also properly implemented.
All right. I'd like to thank you so much, Mr. Taiwo Oyedele. He is a fiscal policy partner and West Africa tax leader at PwC. Thank you so much for sharing your thoughts, as well as Mr. Oyalowo, a political economist, joining us from our Abuja studio. Thank you for your time on the program tonight. Well, we'll take a break now. And when we return, we'll take a look at some activity at the National Assembly. You remember that bill we talked about earlier? Well, that's our focus right after the break. Do stay with us.